if you've got a burning problem you want to solve with a startup, then trying to find that partner who is technical, who believes the things that you believe and shares the same values and is excited about going into this weird type of life as you are. That's a critical thing.
This episode is brought to you by Momento NFT. Momento NFT is a direct-to-fan social NFT app that allows fans to own viral moments from their favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets, autographed merchandise, and more. As a creator, you can easily create valuable images and video NFTs of your best social content. And as a fan, you can own viral moments from your favorite creators and unlock perks like meet and greets. Momento NFT is backed by Animoca brands FTX, Cadenza, and Mark Pincus. Check out the app available on App Store and Google Play. To start the show, so to give the audience a little bit of background, so you started your career as a journalist. You've worked at multiple different publications. You worked in different countries such as New Zealand, Hong Kong, and now Silicon Valley. And prior to starting Substack with your co-founder, you worked at like PandoDaily as well as like Tesla as a writer. And then you worked with your co-founder on his previous startup, from my understanding on like, reading your LinkedIn. So you guys worked on his previous startup. You were on the writing or like creation side. And to start the show, I would love for you to share with us a little bit more about like, how you grew up and how you got to where you are, as well as some like, is there any key lessons that you've learned early on in your career that kind of shape you into who you are today?
It's a pretty massive question, but that is basically the career arc. Yeah, former journalist, moved into working for Tesla, and then worked on Kick with Chris and Jiraj, my two co-founders at Substack. And then Chris and I started Substack and convinced Jiraj to join us really early on. I grew up in a small town. My dad is an atmospheric physicist. My mum was a teacher in New Zealand, in the south of New Zealand. Through high school, discovered or realized I wanted to be a journalist, sort of plotted out a path for myself to have a journalism career. Worked at the student magazine at my university, went on and became the editor of that. Went and did a master's degree in journalism in Canada. Went to Hong Kong at a time when China was really on the rise around the time of the Beijing Olympics, thinking I was going to be a serious foreign correspondent, but ended up writing for an entertainment magazine and writing about music and bars and restaurants, and eventually came to the States with my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, and came over as a freelancer. It was just one way I could get into the country and work. And then ended up working for tech publications, or working for PandoDaily, where I learned about startups and technology companies at a deeper level. I don't know what I learned along the way. I have learned a ton of things. So one thing to take away is that I guess I learned not to be too scared to go after big things. And the worst that could happen is not really that bad. I'm lucky enough to have enough sort of options and have enough sort of stability in my life where I can afford to take big swings. And yeah, I'm really glad I have taken those big swings.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm glad you took the big swing too. Like now we have so many great publications on Substack. So I have a question for you, since you're like a professional journalist before. What is the difference between like the journalism in the past and like the solopreneur creator economy creators now?
There have been journalists who have struck out on their own and done something like what a lot of people are doing on Substack right now, and just with fewer resources and a tougher fight to do it. So I.F. Stone was a famous opinionator and investigative journalist, columnist and editor, who ran his own newsletter, which he printed out on paper and mailed to people in their mailboxes and charged subscription price for it. And that was in I think it was probably the 70s when he was doing that. And then Esther Dyson, who's a sort of a big tech industry figure, had her own newsletter for a long time. That helped establish her career as a venture capitalist as well. And then Ben Thompson, more recently, has been doing it with Stratechery, which is a publication that he runs as a blog and an email newsletter with a subscription price to it. And he's expanding that into podcasting now as well. So the model has been around. It's just been really hard to do. And many reporters, given the existing models to support journalism, have preferred to take jobs in newsrooms. So at a newspaper or a magazine or in a TV news channel, which have always been quite difficult jobs to get. They're quite sought after because journalism is a fulfilling career. And until recently, it used to be something that was quite respected as well. Or like recently, it's a much tougher job. There's much more scrutiny. There's much more heated opinions about the role of media, and a large part of that's because of the changing business models, because of the internet, because of the rise of social media. Yeah, a lot has changed. And hopefully Substack is making it a lot easier for people to strike out on their own, find a path to make a good amount of money to do the work that they find most meaningful. And that is easier than ever. It's simpler now to start a media business than it has been at any time in history.
When you're thinking about like, it's just a lot more challenging to start from today because of like when you think like everyone can start like a Substack or like a newsletter of some sort. But I think so like that makes me think like, isn't the distribution should be what people focusing on? Like you mentioned that there's like maybe like around 20 people. Well, this is like the Palm podcast because that's like probably like 2 months ago. So there was like about 20 people have like made over 1 million on Substack. And then maybe like, most people may make something like, they can go out to eat lunch with the money they made on a Substack. And like there's some other people who just don't charge. So I'm curious, like the people who made it, do they bring on the distribution themselves to the platform, or do they kind of build throughout the time that they spent the time on the platform? How does the distribution piece work?
There's a mix. In the early days of the ecosystem, it's obviously an advantage if you have an existing audience that you can bring over from social media or whatever platform where you might have an audience. But there are plenty of Substack native stars as well, people who have not come with a social media audience, have built it up simultaneously as they've developed their Substack. So the likes of Edwin Dorsey, who's a young finance writer straight out of university, writes a thing called The Bear Cave on Substack. No one had heard of him before he started on Substack. Another thing called Petition, which is an anonymous newsletter started by someone who had no social media presence at all when they started on Substack. Doomberg, which is one of the top earning publications on Substack, is actually, I'm not sure how many people are involved, but it's an anonymous publishing team as well, who did actually build their social network following in conjunction with their Substack following, but had it as a core strategy to build the social media following so they could convert a lot of those people over to their Substack over time. Yeah, I think it's like no one should expect that you just show up and turn on a page of publication at Substack and you're going to get a free audience. You have to work for it. You have to build it up. It's more like the early days of blogging when all of a sudden blogging became a thing and you would set up on Blogger or WordPress or Typepad or whatever you're going to use. And your next, you start writing something and your next problem would be like, all right, how do I get people to pay attention to this? How do I find readers to convert to like following these things regularly? And even in those sort of like more challenging circumstances where you don't have an inbuilt audience, some blogs did rise to huge audiences and some went on to amazing success and influence. And that was partly through people linking to each other and having blog rolls, that kind of stuff. But social media didn't exist in those days. So a huge advantage now is that social media exists and people can build these huge audiences on Twitter or YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, TikTok, and they can bring some of those into their deeper relationships where they have a direct connection with that audience and they have ownership of that audience in Substack. And some of that can turn into a paying audience as well, which means it can be really meaningful money. So yeah, distribution is an important challenge. You don't get it for free. You have to do good work. You have to be consistent. Having social media is a huge tailwind for helping you build that audience. An advantage that has never existed in history, except for the last 20 years. And now on Substack, actually, there are network effects kicking in. So writers are recommending each other. There are profiles that are driving people to publications they might not otherwise have discovered. There are leaderboards, there's search and this kind of stuff. And that kind of a momentum has built to the point where we can actually help quite a lot with distribution now. So 40% of the subscriptions to writers on Substack are coming directly from the Substack network now, which is a new phenomenon as well. And I think it's a pretty profound thing for the development of a new media ecosystem and who can come in and who can succeed in that kind of ecosystem.
Totally. So I have 2 questions on like this subset of questions. What I find really fascinating is like you guys are not using something that's like a drastically life-changing technology. So on the technology end, it's like more on the, I would say like more on the I was saying
Email is
basic.
life-changing.
Email is life-changing, and like I think yeah. So the TLDR is like I feel like the technology wasn't something that like we've never seen before. But like, why did you team like start like taking off compared to some of the other people who are trying to build like a similar product? And I'll save the second question for later.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I've said along the way many times that kind of Substack's real product is its model, the business model. You can come and start a publication. You can choose to make a post free or only for your paid subscribers. And it's going to go across the email and the web. So you have the email for distribution to your loyal people, the people who already know you and are committed to receiving your stuff. And you have the web for distribution to people who haven't already fallen in love with you, who might, and be encountering your work for the first time. But there's a path then for them to become your like retained audience through email or now in a Substack app. I think a huge part of it is timing. There was a cultural shift starting to happen around the time we're starting Substack, which was in the middle of 2017. And one of the shifts was that people were starting to get used to paying for content online, and not only content through the likes of Netflix and Spotify, which this had become a mainstream behavior, but supporting their favorite artists and creators. Patreon was doing really well and had sort of shown that people are willing to support people directly with payments and subscriptions. So we'd seen that big cultural shift. And another cultural shift was people were starting to become a lot more skeptical about social media and being sort of serfs in someone else's kingdom, where you didn't own the relationship with your audience. You were locked into like Facebook or Twitter. And if you wanted to leave, bad luck, you just lose everything. You can't take that audience with you anywhere. And so there's a lot more skepticism and the start of a backlash around these big, giant social media platforms and an appetite for an alternative. So we had a good model at the right time, and the product is good. And then we had a few key influential writers early on who were successful in a way that was visible to other people, that made it clear that the model works, even though it might seem too simple, even though it seems like someone's tried 19 variations of this in the past with a slightly different product stack. Here was actually incontrovertible proof that this model can work and was working.
I think what you said was like totally like makes sense. Like, it's like a couple like big cultural dynamic shifting, and as well as like you guys have a good product, basically like, the right product at the right time that kind of does playing a huge factors there. One of the things that what I found was really impressive is like you guys kind of like identify the core user right away. And like, you mentioned in another interview that like you particularly have a friend who essentially what he did was, he made like 6-figure in like, I don't know if it's the first week, first month, but like at the very beginning. So you guys identify someone made money on this platform, and then you guys were focusing on building the function that he needs for his platform. And I think that was really smart. But like, what are some signs that you feel like early on this is like gonna work? And then what I find really impressive was you guys kind of found a lot of really smart people to just build their audience on their platform, right? How do you kind of attract people there at the beginning and then like kind of like make them stay?
Yeah, there's several things in there. Actually, there was another shift that worked in our favor. MailChimp at the time was just starting to double down on being an e-commerce and email marketing platform. That was already their core business, but they sort of had a side interest in writing, and they had acquired TinyLetter, an email newsletter platform for writers. And then, once writers had hit the subscriber limit on TinyLetter, they could pay to upgrade to MailChimp and keep using MailChimp. But MailChimp was really never designed to be primarily an editorial publishing product. It was an email marketing product. And so at that point in 2017, 2018, MailChimp just sort of decided to like totally focus on being email marketing, which was the smart move for them. And it's a great product, and they've gone on to amazing things. But that worked in our favor because we could say to a bunch of writers who are using MailChimp, like, why are you paying to use this product that's designed for something else? You should use Substack. It's designed for writers, and maybe you can get paid, and it's free if you don't. So that change in MailChimp's focus helped our focus and helped us identify a bunch of people who could just be on Substack. With Bill Bishop, that's the first publisher on Substack. Bill Bishop was a friend of mine. I was reading his newsletter about China for so long, for like 5 years when he came over to be our first customer. Yeah, we designed the product around his early needs. He immediately got to 6 figures of revenue on his first day. He'd been doing it for free basically for 5 years, aside from a couple of donation drives. And I just knew that he was interested in going paid with his newsletter and just hadn't got around to doing it. So I could convince him come and work with us. He knew me and trusted me, and so gave it a shot, and it just worked really well. And you asked before, how did we know? There's something there that it could actually work. What were the early indications? Well, an early indication was that Bill was like that, writing for an audience that could easily justify the subscription price as a business expense, put it on their company credit card, or isn't it on their expense account, because it's professionals reading that newsletter for the most part. But the reason we got really strong confidence that it could be a powerful model for lots more people is that I think the third ever publisher on Substack was Daniel Lavery, who had been one of the editors of a cult humor site called The Toast, and had been publishing stuff on Tiny Letter just because he loved to write and had an audience who still really loved his work, and had maxed out the subscriber limit like twice or 3 times. They kept on raising it for him, and it got to the point where he was going to have to pay to keep on publishing on MailChimp. And we were like, well, you should come to Substack and maybe get paid. And Danny did come across, turned on paid subscriptions. It worked outstandingly well for him as well, despite being a totally different use case from Bill Bishop. Danny's writing like humor stuff for an audience of kind of like librarians in the Midwest, and they were paying out of their own pocket $5 a month, $50 a year. And so we had 2 cases where the model was very clearly working, B2B case and a totally like B2C case with more classic writing. And we thought, well, these can't be, 2 out of the first 3 people we've tried with. And the other one was the second writer was an NBA writer who had been laid off from Yahoo Sports and had a cult following and was doing quite well on Substack as well. But the other 2 were doing outstandingly well. And we were thinking, well, it can't be just that we have found like the only 2 people in the world who can succeed exceedingly well with this model. There must be some more people out there. And if it can work in these totally different use cases, it's kind of incumbent upon us as a moral imperative to try and make it work for as many people as possible. And so that's when we decided to like press the gas down on Substack.
Essentially, the core product is like the paywall, right? Like, and then later on, you guys like did, there's like a podcast function, there's like other functions to like onboard it onto Substack. At the beginning, how do you know what function to build? And then like, what are some, I'm sure there's like a lot of noises that like people want different things. And then you guys kind of like rejected a bunch of people's like, wishes or whatever you say. So how do you identify what to build? And then in terms of like, since like you come from a writing or like journalism background, like how do you kind of like find a place in the company as well? Like, because I know it's like the core product is like building towards, for someone like yourself, but we live in the Silicon Valley. A lot of people, when like, since they're like non-technical, they're like having like a really hard spot for them to like, should I start a company or should I join a company? Like, or, how should we make ourselves like more like helpful for the company when we're joining a company as a non-technical founder? Can you share like a little bit on that? Like, as a non-technical founder, how do you, thrive at your own startup?
On the product side, like, we started off as being totally just paid newsletters. You could only have paid newsletters. And then we figured out, well, actually the best way to start a paid newsletter is to first have a free newsletter. So we should make it, instead of having people create a newsletter somewhere on MailChimp or something, they should create their free newsletter on Substack. And then when they're ready, they can go paid. And that started to like give us a good like top of funnel, a good list of people who are just using Substack, exposing it to their friends and readers and priming them for maybe going paid one day. It worked really well. And then when we added things, it was often because of strong interest from writers who really wanted it and were doing really well on Substack. So Anthony Pompliano, Pomp, who you referenced his podcast before I was on that a couple of weeks ago, he really wanted to have an audio feature so he could start doing some lightweight podcasting through Substack. So he added podcasting on Substack really early, although it was in keeping with the roadmap we had in mind for ourselves. We've always had in mind for ourselves. And we gave this speech at Demo Day at the end of YC in March 2018. It's always like, we're a subscription publishing platform. We're going to start with writing and help people make money through writing and paid newsletters. But then we're going to expand and turn those into communities. And then we'll add audio and video. And there'll be entirely new types of media businesses created. That's what's happening. We've just recently added video in an early beta. It'll get more and more developed. We're starting to do a hell of a lot in community. We launched a new feature called Chat just the other day, where people can have their kind of own private social network. So that's how we develop the product and decide what to add. It's always in talking to the writers who are using Substack. There are 3 of us at the company. How do I fit into the company as a non-technical person?
Well, by the way, I have a lot of respect for you, and then I'm personally non-technical. And then like, I think like the biggest challenge as a non-technical founder is like, number one, like whenever you're pitching to an investor or something, like they're always expecting there's like a cutting edge technology behind the company. So like constantly pitching to investor, they're expecting you to be technical. And then the other part is like as a company grew, I definitely think like non-technical is like really like important for the company, because of like if it's just a technology, it's not really a company, right? So I think like you are a perfect example for someone who is like non-technical and then started a company around the problem that like you see your friends have, and then like it's like a thriving company. So would love to like hear how you kind of like get to where you are.
Okay, thank you. I'm definitely non-technical. I had the privilege of teaming up with Chris early on, and it was actually Chris who convinced me we got to do this together. I'd been resisting because I was about to have my first kid and didn't want to get into the startup game and become a founder who has no time and is constantly stressed and has to go through this traumatic journey of running the startup. But Chris convinced me, along with my wife, that we just had to do this, and that's a perfect meeting of my interests and experience. And Chris is technical; he's an engineer and a product guy and a business guy, so he was a perfect partner. So I guess one sort of piece of advice would be, if you've got a burning problem you want to solve with a startup, then trying to find that partner who is technical, who believes the things that you believe and shares the same values and is excited about going into this weird type of life as you are. That's a critical thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it was my genius that figured out how to crack the code of being a non-technical founder in a startup that went on to do something interesting. I would more credit that to Chris's genius for identifying how useful it would be to have a founding partner who totally understands the market we're trying to play in and totally understands the life and mindset of the customers, writers in our case, that we're trying to serve. But I do think, to speak in favor of non-technical founders and non-technical people who might be early in startups, that storytelling is incredibly important. And for us, it's been so critical to everything we've done. We literally launched the company with an essay. We wrote this essay. It was kind of like a manifesto, like, why does something like Substack need to exist? Why can it succeed? And what are we going to do about it? We published that weeks before we launched the first publication. And then once we launched the first publication, and then the next one, we started doing convincing reporters who I was able to convince to write about us because they're my peers and I knew how they think and we knew each other, to write about these stories of success. And that would lead on to other press. And then our writing would lead on to other attention from other people. And people started coming to us to say, hey, I'm interested in trying this. I'm interested in this model. And then the social skills as well. Like, a lot of technical people do have great social skills. Often you'll find many are like less interested in the social side, more interested in the coding side or the business side. But being able to get out there and help persuade people of the importance of the thing that you're doing and how it can also change their lives. If you've got that kind of talent, then that's really hard to buy, and any founding team would be lucky to have that in the team.
For sure, I totally agree with you on like finding a partner who values your skill, as well as like doing the part that's like I think storytelling is like highlighted by many of the investors, that they think this is like one of the top skills that a founder should have. And I definitely see like the value there. And in terms of like telling a good story, like what is your like 1 minute crash course on to tell a good story? Like, many of the listeners are founders or like, are people who are trying to start something on their own. Like, what's your suggestion on like, information diet, or like, what is like the TLDR on like basically essentially how to tell a good story?
Make sure you believe what you're saying. I think that's the major thing. It's like you can't storytell your way into major business success if the things underlying the story are not true. And you need to be able to convince yourself first. I don't mean delude yourself. I mean test your thinking, understand what you're thinking and what you're saying, and then write down for yourself first, what is the reason that you think this thing you're going to do is important and can be successful, and then what are the steps for how you can get there. And then you can test it and read it and edit it and see like where are your weaknesses, where are your strengths, and then keep on iterating on it until you have a strong story that you're confident in and that you believe, and that when you tell it a million times to people, it's going to come across as having conviction and emotional force behind it. There's a whole lot of things about, you could learn about being a good writer. I don't think overhyping things is ever helpful. I think under promising and over delivering is more effective, even though that's a counterintuitive instinct in Silicon Valley. Yeah, but say things that are true and that you believe, and then say the best version of that.
What was it like when you guys first started pitching to investors? And then like at the stock market, you guys still have like, pretty steady, like kind of like income coming in instead of like depending purely on the investor money. I'm curious, like, what was it like for you guys to just starting out when you approach investors? And then I know the sentiment now, it's like, since you guys are raised like so much money already, and then you guys are valued at like over $500 million. Like, I'm just curious, like, throughout the journey, like, what was it like in terms of approaching investors? And then is there any tips for like media companies to like go out there and then actually, thrive?
We had a head start because Chris came from Kick, which was he was one of the founders of Kick. He was a chief technology officer there. That's a great background to come from. And then I was kind of like a domain expert in journalism and writing, and I'd worked at Tesla, and I'd been a journalist and written a book. So that was helpful to like the founding team mix and like knowing what we were talking about and having some proven track record. So people were willing to have a conversation with us in the first place is an advantage. If investors are skeptical of media businesses, like content businesses, like we've seen a lot of flops in the past. Substack, we never positioned ourselves as a content business or a media business. We're a media platform. We're like a place for people to come and build their own businesses. And that is fundamentally different to being something like a publication. So we're not like BuzzFeed, but we are like YouTube kind of. Still, there was like quite a bit of skepticism in the early days about like, is anyone going to pay for paid newsletters? Like, how many Bill Bishops are there out in the world? And this is where the storytelling is important. Where like because in those early days when your startup is just a germ, you don't really have huge numbers to point to necessarily. In our case, we were lucky quite early with Bill. And then Danny Lavery to be able to point to two really strong successes and actual revenue. But it was still small. Like even at the end of YC, there were only 7,000 paid subscribers across all Substack. Now there's more than 1.5 million. But we had a story that we believed, which is that people will pay for writers they trust or love. You can see it. It's been done before. Ben Thompson's doing it. You can see it in Patreon. We believe subscriptions are the future. You can see it in The Athletic. You can see it in The Information. You can see it in these other examples that have come and gone. And we thought that there's an opportunity for people to really, people might be willing to pay to improve their media diet because they've seen the consequence of an abundance of free, like very engaging, addictive content, and they're willing to pay to have something not that. So we had that story, and then when people said something to us like, "Well, how many Bill Bishops are there out there? How many paid newsletters could there possibly be?" Our answer is like, we think that millions of people will be willing to pay to have better content, to have closer relationships with the writers they most trust. And so having that strong story and a couple of strong examples and the good founding team dynamic and mix was really helpful for us in overcoming some of the barriers and the sort of emotional resistance to like content businesses and the investor community.
How do you like keep finding these people who are like the two strong writers that you've mentioned? So number one is like, how do you find, like, how do you replicate the success, right? And then number two is like, I know that you started as like, you probably recruited a lot of your friends or since you've been in the industry for quite a bit, and then like who is a good person, like who is a good writer, who's not. And I'm just curious, like how do you replicate that to like a larger scale, since like from like 7,000 to like 1.5 million, it's like a really huge difference there.
Yeah, well, we identified the people we thought, the character type we thought could succeed with the Substack model, for whom it would work really well. And they're people who have to be willing to sort of be a little bit entrepreneurial, willing to take on a little bit of risk, and people who have the discipline to run their own business essentially. So who are always going to show up and write and like deliver for their readers, and people who are good, like they had to have a distinctive voice and a distinctive worldview, and their writing had to be a little bit special and differentiated. So we kind of decided that the character type we were looking for was the outsider nerd. And these terms we use both like in an affectionate way. So then they're an outsider in that they don't fit comfortably in the mainstream media economy, or they bristle against it, or they sort of wish they could be above it. Or they're a nerd in that they're particularly knowledgeable or passionate about a particular subject area. And we could find those people by looking at who had newsletters already, who were successful bloggers, who was saying something interesting on Twitter and as well followed and respected there, or on Facebook or on Instagram, who's at a major publication, who might be more successful outside of that publication, who could be independent and has a readership that's there waiting to support them. We chased those leads and chased that thinking and found there are a bunch of really good people. And then success of those early people got a lot of attention, and journalism especially is a small community, and people would talk to each other about their experiences on Substack, and a lot of them were like life-changingly good experiences. And so these people would become kind of the sales and marketing people for Substack. We never built up a sales team. We built up a partnerships team where the people who've worked at Substack, who worked with writers, would develop these strong trust relationships with writers and really help them succeed, give them the support and business advice to make them successful on Substack, so that those people would go and become evangelists for other writers to join Substack, and the snowball roles like that.
Let's say if you and I start a newsletter on Substack, how should we kind of like stand out from the crowd? And then like, how should we build the distribution? Do we need to like tweet every single day about our article on Twitter, or like how do we kind of like get the word out and then, making sure people pay?
The first thing is to do something. Like start a publication and start writing, get feedback, and then keep improving in response to the feedback. See if you can make something that people want. It's very helpful to own a certain area, a niche. So not just US politics, but US politics and economics, or not just women's basketball, but like women's basketball in the South, for example.
So like niche down.
So like, yeah, you don't want to go too niche. You want there to be a large enough market so that there will be 1,000 people somewhere in the world who are willing to pay $50 a year to subscribe to you, because that's most places enough to support an income, enough to support a living. But you don't want to be so broad that you're just another voice in politics or another voice in sports. You want to have an advantage. You want to have an unfair advantage. And one of those unfair advantages is the distinctiveness of your voice and your worldview. No one else can be you in the world. No one else can have your specific worldview in the world. And then write, and don't overthink it. Publish, get feedback. If it's something that you never tire of, like you're just so interested in this particular subject or this style of writing that you'll like always be excited to do it, or you'll do it even on the days where you're feeling like maybe you have to drag your ass to the keyboard, then you're off to, then you've got your foundation. And then people have to know that you're doing this work here. So you can't just type into a box, click publish, and just hope people are going to show up. Network effects on Substack are starting to help that a little bit. But you need to tell people. You need to tell people that you're doing something valuable, and that the way to find you where you're doing that valuable work is to go click on this link or go to this URL. And so you can do that in multiple ways. You can go speak at events. You can do an interview with a local newspaper. You can publish stuff to LinkedIn or Twitter or YouTube and all those other, and social media is a powerful lift for that kind of thing. But the most important thing is like tell people where to go find this important work.
Okay, so I have two questions there. So one about like, you mentioned like tell people about it, like post on social media and all that stuff. So how do I convert from like one social platform onto Substack? Like, because my biggest fear is like, what if I launch a newsletter? It's just my mom subscribe. And then like, that's like my biggest fear. And then like at what point do I kind of like convert them onto Substack? And number two is like you mentioned about like, getting feedback really quick. I think writing or like long form article is like the hardest part to get like feedback because people have to actually read your super long essay. And then like right now people are still super distracted. And like, you mentioned about like, people go on TikTok or consume these kind of like, basically junk food, like information diet, right? So like people are really used to have these kind of like really fast speed consumptions. I'm curious, like how should we think about like the getting feedback part if no one ever actually read my stuff?
Well, for a start, it is only going to be your mum who subscribes to your newsletter, probably, or the 5 friends that you tell, or the like
Yeah.
you send it out to 100 friends and it resonates with 5 and they sign up. And you should be grateful for any reader, and you write for that reader and respond to their feedback and be okay with it. You having a small audience, because for most people in the world, there's no way to get around having a small audience to start with. You're building something and it takes time. But you just keep on showing up. And like one day you might wake up, you've got 10 readers. The next month you might wake up, it's like you've got 100 readers. And then in a year it's 1,000 readers, and the growth starts compounding. The more people you have in your mailing list, the more potential evangelists you have. And it's not going to be given to you for free. But it is easier than any time in history to grow and to have that chance of growing. People are spending a lot of time on Twitter and TikTok and all the others, but they will, for something that really resonates with them, like the person they really connect with, they will go deep. There's long form, like 3-hour video essays on YouTube that are going crazy right now. They're like some of the top writers on Substack making millions of dollars a year, writing these extremely long essays or long pieces of reported news. But it's how do you get people to cross that hump to go on the longer rides with you in the first place? You've kind of got to build trust with them over time, which is, it goes back to that, do something, keep working on it, stick with it, prove that it's quality, prove that you can keep delivering quality over time, because you are saying something that no one else in the world is saying. And you'll get some people, and then you get some more people, and they'll start to build a movement with you. I will say it's not guaranteed. Like no one's guaranteed success with this. It's really hard. You're trying to be a like media personality. Not everyone gets to be a media personality. Like sometimes people fail. One thing that is certainly true of everyone who succeeds is that they stuck with it.
Is there a template to it, like to write like a heat piece or like a top piece on Substack?
No, I wouldn't say that there is a template and you just have to copy and paste into the template and you're going to succeed. That's definitely not true. But there are probably some principles in common among the successful writers. And one of them might be that you're courageous enough to say something that not everyone's willing to say, that you're saying it in a voice that not everyone has, that you're saying it from a particular point of view that not everyone has, and that there's quality of thought there. It's not just cheap outrage or clickbait type of stuff, or like you're saying it because not because you believe it, but because you think it might stir someone's attention. It has to be good. And so you have to like write what you're good at thinking about.
There's a really broad question on like, what do you think is like the future of media? Since like there's a person said, so he said essentially everything is like bundling and unbundling. So in the future, do you see people keep going on this solopreneur journey, or like do you feel like people are going to bundle back to like start their own publications?
Yeah, so the future of media, there are some global digital giants that will continue to stay strong. New York Times, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, these kinds of publications and outlets. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are sort of niche focused publications with one person running each one, or like a small team running each one. There's a lot of Substacks at the moment. And in the middle, there's a big hollowing out and like a reorganization. Basically, it's been very painful. Lots of newspapers are shutting down, lots of city newspapers and magazines, and journalists losing jobs, all that kind of stuff. In the future, I do think like those New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, that kind of category. Those are already like successful bundles that are incumbent and probably aren't going to go anywhere in the meantime, in the near future. But the other end of the spectrum, the Substacks of the world, could be rebundled at some point, and it could happen in multiple ways that start to fill out the middle along the way. And media, I think, can be really rebuilt in an exciting way like that. And with something like Substack, it totally removes the barrier to entry, and so a lot more people can come in and try to get into the media economy, and a lot more people can come in and succeed in the media economy because the internet's amazing, free distribution globally instantly, and a way for money to travel between people from various countries without having to rely on gatekeepers and getting shares of revenue from advertising that eventually trickle down to you. So the media economy can become much more, can become much bigger, can be much more valuable, can be much more diverse and exciting, with a lot more voices and different types of voices than are currently sort of allowed in the media economy. And I think that the rebundling will happen, and Substack will be part of it, and the publications that are on Substack and publications like that will be a part of it, and that's a pretty exciting future to look forward to.
I think there is another big shift towards like how people are spending money, right? Like I think like right now you've seen people spending, like you mentioned, like maybe this could be like reimbursed by the company because of like this is like essentially like company, it could be like a company subscription. But in terms of like in the future, have you guys thought about like creating some sort of business model around the advertisers? Because I've seen, like Packy McCormack does really well at like, creating his newsletter, as well as like there's just like always endless of sponsors on each of his newsletter on there. I'm just curious, like, have you guys thought about like the, 2B play there to maybe essentially negotiate on the writer's behalf to companies?
Yeah, lots of people have sort of suggested this to us. We may do something maybe at some point in the future, but we're not thinking about it right now. We are extremely focused on subscriptions and direct payments between readers and writers, and think that's a really powerful model with exceptional potential. There's been 30 years of innovation around online advertising, but there hasn't been 30 years of innovation around direct payments and subscriptions in media and online media. And in fact, like if you look at what happens in China with online media and like WeChat and different styles of subscription payments and different styles of like direct payments and buying tokens that can be used and buying like emojis and other digital products. There's so much like exciting stuff that is so far underexplored in the West and the US. And I think there's a much more glorious future to be built by leaning hard into the areas where there's new discoveries to be made, rather than to be sort of like dragging across some of the old models from the old era where that come with different sets of problems. And so we're not like anti-advertising as a like moral philosophy, but we're very, very pro subscriptions and direct payments as a way to build entirely new types of businesses and ecosystems.
Do you guys see like any kind of slowing down on the subscription side, since like right now we're in an economic downturn, and then so many people essentially just like got like financially challenged by the current, like essentially
we haven't seen too much of that. No, I mean the growth rate in general has been pretty steady and constant despite the fluctuations in the market. There was a change around the pandemic and sort of the end of lockdowns, where like the start of lockdowns and through the heat of the lockdowns, that was a like hyper growth period for companies like Substack and sort of creator economy companies and actually news companies as well, I think. And then once the lockdowns ended, that all cooled down a bit. But in terms of like people's willingness to spend money on subscriptions, we don't see much of it beyond anecdotes. And I think it's because it's not the same as advertising. Advertising is the first thing a company is going to cut when they budget slashing in a recession. But subscriptions, where it's you as an individual paying for a writer who you love or trust, that's already like a quite deeply emotional and almost irrational relationship. Like you might pay $100 a year for The Atlantic or something like that, which is a big magazine with lots of writers and a big staff, and a ton of content coming to you all the time. But you might pay $150 a year for someone like Bill Bishop, or $100 a year for someone like Matt Iglesias. where it's just one writer that you have a relationship with that you're paying the same as you paid for a whole magazine.
Mhm.
And so the decision making that goes into a subscription purchase is not like, am I getting a good amount of content for my dollar? And, if I'm tightening my belt, I should cut that on a content per dollar decision basis. It's more like I have a sort of deep attachment to this particular person. I don't have that many relationships like this. And it takes a lot for you to kind of give up on that.
Okay, one last question before we jump into a 1-minute fire round. So I'm personally subscribed to like a lot of paid subscriptions, but I don't finish everybody, right? Like, so
Yes.
I go, like, if I have time, I'll like read from beginning to the end for like 1% or whatever. But like, I'm curious, like, do you guys have any like rates on like, how many people actually finish from like every single article by this person? Or is this like really common? Or like, is this like people subscribe to a bunch of stuff and then like they finish maybe like 30% of whatever?
I think that's pretty common. We don't have stats at the tips of our fingers about that. You can't actually measure that in the email. You can in the app and on web, but it's not a huge thing we focus on. The more important thing really is sort of like, how much money is the writer making from these relationships? And you don't have to read everything to, like, you're the reader, you're in charge. You get to decide what you want to put into your brain. And if it's not doing it for you, you can opt out. But the beauty of the subscription relationship is that the writer's financial well-being doesn't depend on you having like a deep love for every piece of content. You don't have to like click the like button on every piece of content. You'll understand that you have this trust relationship with this writer. Like, some of these things are going to be absolute bangers that are going to get your heart pounding, and some of them are going to be like, well, I'll just skip that one, and like, but I know there's going to be something good in the future.
Thank you. Okay, so we are in the last 1-minute fire round question for you. Okay, number one is like, what's your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book. God, I hate these kind of questions.
Okay,
One book called Paddy Clark, Ha Ha Ha, by Roddy Doyle, had a huge impact on me when I was a teenager. I really love that book.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
It's a cross between Patrick Crudson, who's my very close friend, who's an editor. He's now chief product guy at a news organization in New Zealand, who was the editor of the student magazine I went on to become the editor of, who really was like raised my standard in terms of professional work and then gave me the job after he left it. Cross between him and Elon Musk, because I worked for Elon and Elon hired me, and it was a crazy experience. And it's not like it wasn't totally positive, but it was mind expanding. So those two people.
What was like a lesson that you learned there?
Plan for success, think really big, be really ambitious, and plan to succeed. And then if you don't succeed along the way, then you adjust and you make adjustments until you succeed again.
Love it. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh God. I'll have a small group because that will save us time. Lord, the singer from New Zealand, who is my hero. Stephen Adams, another New Zealander who plays in the NBA for the Memphis Grizzlies, is a center. Maybe Patrick Collison, the CEO of Stripe.
Right. Okay, nice. Where can we find you outside of work?
At home with my kids, struggling to get them into the bath, struggling to get them into bed, and struggling to get them out of bed in the morning, struggling to get them fed for breakfast, and their lunch is packed, and then dropping them off at school. And then that's it. Maybe sometimes I'll go to a gig and see some music.
What's your favorite Substack? This is the last question.
It's a controversial sort of thing to reveal my preference for. I'll go with it. It's the NBA season right now. I'm quite a big fan of the NBA. There's a really good one called Good Morning It's Basketball, which is a daily recap of the games from the night before with some commentary and highlights reels. It's really well done, and I'm a religious reader of it.
Awesome. Hamish, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Okay, thanks very much. Nice to talk to you.